Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast that celebrates trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstis, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. I'm delighted to say that this, the 13th season of the podcast, is a serialisation of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. Chapter 13. In the Red Corner. Courage, sacrifice, determination, commitment, toughness, heart, talent, guts. That's what little girls are made of. The heck with sugar and spice. Bethany Hamilton, professional surfer. If it wasn't bad enough that historically dubious medicine stopped women playing sport because of the supposed risks to their bodies and fertility, even when women have been allowed to participate, the sports science has invariably assumed that women's bodies were just small versions of men's. It's ironic that it was men talking about women's bodies for years that led to the banning of them from sport. But now we have men in sport who don't want to talk about women's bodies, and that too has a negative impact. It is a relief, then, that this topic is finally being aired publicly. Media, coaches, and sports organisations are talking openly about issues facing female athletes, including the impact of hormones on their bodies and performance, the increased prevalence of female sports injuries, and the difference in the effects of concussion on the female brain. The topic of periods and how they impact female athletes got its first big airing in 2015 when British tennis player Heather Watson blamed girl things on her exit from the Australian Open. The week that followed saw huge media coverage with other female athletes coming forward to talk more openly about their monthly cycles and their effect on performance. The BBC hosted a debate to explore, are periods the final taboo in sport? While some people think talking about the issues caused by periods can be a double-edged sword, undoing all the good work that's taken place to reassure men that women aren't less capable once a month when they're menstruating, is actually incredibly important that menstrual cycles become a normal part of conversation across all of society. More research is needed in this area, but sports scientists agree that women may be more prone to injury when estrogen is at its peak level around the time of ovulation, as the presence of the hormone can make tendons and ligaments more lax and elastic. The menstrual cycle is an inflammatory process, and excess inflammation can result in an injury, says Dr. Georgie Brunvels, a sports physiologist specialising in this area. It's not solely down to high levels of estrogen, but tracking the cycle is also very important in terms of bone injury risk. The fact that fantastic progress is being made in this area became very apparent in early 2020 when Chelsea announced that they were the first football club in the world to tailor their training to players' menstrual cycles. Manager Emma Hayes was the driving force behind the initiative, having noticed that her players' performance, mood, and energy were directly impacted by where they were in their cycle. Hayes and her team at Chelsea worked with Dr. Brunvels, who developed the Fitter Woman app for the sports science company Oracle. The app allows women to input information about their menstrual health and related symptoms, which can then be logged and monitored. With the consent of the players, Chelsea's coaches can access their information to tailor their training programs. The starting point is that we are women, and ultimately, we go through something very different to men on a monthly basis, reflected Hayes at the time. We have to have a better understanding of that because our education failed us at school. We didn't get taught about our reproduction systems. It comes from a place of wanting to know more about ourselves and understanding how we can improve our performance. I'm a female coach in an industry where women have always been treated like small men. The starting point is that we are women, and ultimately we go through something very different to men on a daily basis. I think it's a subject that's been a taboo, and there have been a lot of unknowns for us. So to bring that out into the open and deal with it quite normally, as we do with nutrition, will be really helpful. I love that Emma also sees that this is just the beginning of something that will become normal in the future. These players are going to be the first generation of women who are well educated about their menstrual cycle, and they will spread the knowledge as far as they possibly can, and we hope that becomes a culture within every football club in the world. Along with the physical impact of menstruation, for many teenage girls, periods can be a significant factor in their decision to stop taking part in sport. So many considerations that boys will never have to contemplate. How can I swim? What if I leak in the water? Will my pad show beneath my tight gymnastics leotard or my skimpy volleyball shorts? What if my tampon string pokes out from my tiny athletics briefs when I'm hurdling? What if I leak when I'm playing in a white tennis dress or white football shorts? What do I do with my pads or tampons if I'm in an all-male changing room with no sanitary bins? Sport England research for 2017 to 18 showed that among 14 to 16-year-old girls, 42% say their period prevents them from taking part in physical activity in school. Even women at the top of their game face this issue, as was highlighted in an article in The Telegraph in 2020. One international rugby player told the paper that while it wasn't shocking not to have sanitary bins because it was what they were used to, it only really came home to her when she was on her period and trying to get rid of a tampon. Because there wasn't a bin in the loo, I got blood on my shorts. Most countries in the Six Nations play in white shorts, so I can hardly be the first woman this has happened to. Despite the positive changes in the conversation around the impact of menstrual cycles, it was shocking to read in the BBC's 2020 Elite British Sportswomen survey that 40% of respondents said they did not feel comfortable discussing their period with their coaches. That is 40% of women at the very top of their game on the elite pathway who can't discuss something that has enormous impact on their bodies and potential performance. And this was even though 60% of respondents in the survey said their performance had been affected by their period and that they had missed training or competitions because of it. Athletes reported a whole host of practical issues they regularly faced, including white clothing, no sanitary bins, wearing the same tampon or pad for hours on end, along with issues many women face each month, including painful cramps and bloating. Clearly, these physical symptoms present a much bigger challenge if you're an elite athlete who has to compete at her very best in front of a crowd, when perhaps all you want to do is snuggle down on the couch with a hot water bottle until the pain passes. Many young female athletes now take birth control pills to help the timings of their periods, so they don't coincide with major events or take them all year round to avoid periods altogether. As the BBC report pointed out, we live in a world largely designed by men, for men. Sporting laws and stadiums are designed with men in mind, whether or not those in charge realise it. Take cricket, for example. In the laws, you're not actually allowed to leave the field to go for a wee, said Scotland's Katie McGill. In a 50-over game, you're out there for 3 hours or more. A lot of us will double up with a tampon and a pad. It's not great. If you get the wrong day, you're running around a lot, and then in the in-between bits, you're standing still a lot. You have time to think about it. Some of the women who responded to the survey say they would not be comfortable discussing their period with their coaches, many of whom are middle-aged men. The women were worried their period problems would be used against them in selection, and they did not want to be seen as finding an excuse for underperforming. Lack of access to period products can also be an issue that stops girls playing sport. So it is wonderful to see high-profile sporting role models like Steph Houghton, captain of the Lionesses and Manchester City, backing the Period Poverty campaign. I asked Steph why she had become an ambassador for the charity. For girls who are a bit less privileged in terms of not having access to tampons or pads, I think it's important for us to try and encourage them to continue playing sport. Periods shouldn't affect you playing the sport you want to do, or being in school and doing PE. We should strive to encourage young girls to play. Show them that even if we do have periods, we can still do whatever we want to do. That should never stop us. When it comes to experts in the field of women's health in sport, there are few more knowledgeable than Dr. Emma Ross. Emma led the English Institute of Sport's female athlete health team with a Smart Her initiative, encouraging athletes, coaches and support staff to have conversations and to consider female physiology and psychology in training, recovery, nutrition and the coaching environment. Emma explained to me that after the Beijing Olympics, it became clear that British women weren't winning medals at the rate of men, and UK sport was keen to understand why. Having spoken to those supporting athletes, it became very apparent that for all the work on marginal gains, making tiny percentage improvements with technical alterations to kit, equipment and training methods, there were some huge considerations around female physiology that were being ignored. Emma and her team did insight work with coaches, practitioners, and the athletes themselves to establish if female-specific factors were being considered when training and preparing. The answer was a resounding no. We were training women in a way that had worked for men. We were taking programs that had worked for men and simply transplanting them into women, ignoring the fact that women have all these very specific things that are just about being a woman. They aren't a weakness, they are just part of her as an athlete, but we were ignoring them, said Emma. The EIS set about educating everyone about these differences. It was important for the coaches and practitioners to understand why it was important. A big part of the motivation was seeing the significant improvements in performance that could result from better understanding and adaptation of training. But before they could start educating people, they needed to take a step back and ask, is anyone even comfortable about having these conversations right now? It turned out that lots of people weren't. We found that the male coaches, through no fault of their own, had not even factored in any of this stuff. We have created a culture in sport where women are changing who they are to try and belong. Changing to be more like the men and not talk about menstrual cycles, pelvic floors or breasts because we're going to be more like the men to fit into the system, said Emma. The EIS work focused on menstrual cycles, breast and pelvic floor health, and considerations to reduce injuries in women that might result from female biomechanics or hormones. We're not going to ever be able to make it so that women don't feel the experience of their menstrual cycle. That's not what we're trying to do. We're saying if there's anything in your life as a female, and that could be your cycle, or leaking urine, or bladder or bowel problems related to pelvic health, or injuries related to your hormones or breast health, whatever it is, we just need to address it because it hasn't even been considered up until now. I asked Emma about the belief that the pill was the silver bullet for sportswomen, stopping their cycles and preventing any negative impact. It turns out it's not as simple as that. It's not always my go-to place, she told me. The menstrual cycle is a vital sign of health. Where female athletes are doing too much training and not fueling enough, the menstrual cycle disappears, because of the stress that's been placed on the body. That's a really good signal. I lost my period, I'd better adjust. It turns out different pills can also affect women's performance, and Emma adds, the other thing about our female hormones is that they're amazing. They're amazing for us, our bodies, our bone strength, our cardiovascular strength, our brain health, our breast health. And again, it's educating people that's a real positive of having them. An area I'd not really considered was the importance of sports bras and the difference they can make to performance. I was really surprised when Emma told me, if you were wearing a poorly fitting sports bra and you started a marathon alongside a clone of you, identical in every way, apart from she was wearing a brilliant fitting sports bra, she would finish a mile ahead of you. That's a 4% improvement in performance. Emma explained how women's breasts move when they run, and this movement affects gait and running style. This can lead to a shortening of the stride so less ground is covered. The upper body then starts to activate more muscles to try and counteract this, and more energy is used. This can also affect breathing mechanics as ribs are trying to move and become tense. Some women wear compression sports bras, which can be restrictive and hinder breathing. All these small things add up over a marathon and contribute to the significant difference. While it was fantastic to learn that changes are being made in many areas, for instance, all women in Team GB were receiving bespoke sports bras ahead of the Tokyo Games, there's still so much to be done. No longer working at the EIS, in 2021, Emma, in partnership with Baz Moffat and Dr. Bella Smith, launched The Well HQ, a digital hub to empower active women and the people who support them with the knowledge needed to optimise health, happiness and performance. Hopefully, this initiative will ensure all women are able to better understand their bodies. The impact of periods is not something that only affects young women starting out in sport or elite sportswomen. I didn't discover triathlon until I was 46, but having tried a sprint version of the event in 2012, in January 2013, I announced to my family that I wanted to qualify to represent Great Britain as an age group athlete. 6 months later, and 2 stone lighter, having learned to ride a racing bike and whip off a wetsuit, I did just that and proudly pulled on my GB kit to compete at the World Championships in London. For the next 2 years, I continued to represent my country at European and World Championships, taking part in key qualification events in the build-up to each one to gain selection. All in all, this meant that for about 10 weekends every year, I would be immersed in the world of competitive triathlons. My journey into triathlon coincided with my approaching menopause, and with that came changes to my menstrual cycle that I had never anticipated. Just as it is taboo for women to talk about periods, talking about menopause can be even more of a challenge. After years of hearing disparaging remarks, mocking grumpy females having hot flushes, women are hardly likely to declare to the world what is happening to their bodies. For me, the biggest surprise was the change to my monthly cycle. I'd always been pretty regular with my periods, both in how often they occurred and how long they lasted. I'd naively assumed that as I neared menopause, they would just get lighter and less frequent, until eventually they stopped completely at about 53, the average age that a woman goes through the menopause. But no, it turns out that was not the case, and nor is it for millions of women. Mother Nature has other plans as our fertility comes to an end. My periods became much heavier and much more frequent. At one point, I was having extremely heavy periods almost every fortnight. My problem, which will be familiar to many women, was how I could get through the event without the opportunity to change my tampon. When taking part in a triathlon, there is some pre-race preparation as you rack your bike and get into your wetsuit before filing down to get into the water to start your race. Even with a last-minute dash, invariably standing in a long queue for a portaloo before pulling up my wetsuit, this meant it could be about 4 hours from start to finish. Hearing the despair in my voice as I realised I'd come on again the night before another big race, my lovely husband took it upon himself to head out to the local supermarket in search of some extra large tampons that might help me through the long Olympic distance event the next day. Now, if that's not love and devotion, I'm not sure what is. I remember one qualification race at Belvoir Castle where I genuinely thought I was going to have a carry moment, a cultural reference for those of a certain age, and that I'd be finishing the 10K with blood running down my tired legs. I didn't, but the struggle of dealing with my period certainly had a negative impact on my taking part in a sport I loved. When I stopped racing in 2018, it was with some relief that I wouldn't have to face the challenge of dealing with competitive sport and periods anymore. Along with all the issues associated with hormones and women's bodies, female sports science is also developing rapidly in areas such as concussion. Research indicates that in sports open to all genders, women are more prone to concussion than men, with one comprehensive study showing that girls had a concussion rate of 1.7 per thousand athlete exposures, with boys at 1 per thousand. In addition, the concussion symptoms last for longer for female athletes, and it also takes women and girls longer to recover. Some believe the higher rate of concussion is because women have weaker muscles in their necks and shoulders to absorb the impact. But scientists are also exploring the reasons why women tend to have more severe symptoms and take longer to recover. Without spending too much time on the detailed science here, it was over 30 years ago that I studied sports physiology at university, after all, it appears that it could well be to do with the difference in the tiny, fragile axons, the nerve cells in the brain, each about 100th the size of a human hair. Male axons are larger, with a more complex structure than women's. This means that when concussion occurs and the axons are damaged in the women's brains, little microtubules inside the axon are more likely to rupture, which can ultimately lead to the destruction or death of some of the axons. So while men's brains and nerve cells might be recovering after a concussion, given the same type of head impact, women's brain cells may be degenerating even more. With newspapers such as The Telegraph writing detailed reports about female concussions in 2019, it's a relief that the topic is now being widely aired. Pink Concussions is the first ever non-profit organisation to focus on pre-injury education and post-injury medical care for women and girls with brain injury, including concussion incurred from sport. It shares some stark observations on its website. 1. Women and girls sustain more concussions at a higher rate than their male counterparts in sports with similar rules. 2. Women and girls have been documented to have a higher number and more severe symptoms than males. 3. Women and girls tend to have longer recovery periods than males and more post-concussion syndrome. They also point out that since women and girls are rarely educated about female brain injury, they are not prepared to cope with the higher number and more severe symptoms, as well as the longer recovery times and the risk of prolonged concussion symptoms, formerly known as post-concussion syndrome. These women and girls, along with their family, friends, teachers, or employers, are often unprepared for the recovery ahead and have unrealistic expectations of the time needed to heal. In addition to the physiological differences outlined above, another study has identified that while male concussions are generally caused by collisions between players, female players were more vulnerable to concussion while falling following contact. Dawn Comstock, a professor in the Department of Epidemiology at the Colorado School of Public Health, flags another potential reason for the gender disparity in cases when she talks to Jessica Luther for Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back. It could be the physiological reasons cited, but undoubtedly there are also socio-cultural issues going on. There's a ton of really good research out there that says women are just more willing to talk about their physical health than men are. We live in a society where girls playing sport may be more likely to report their concussion than boys, who are determined to appear more traditionally tough, shrug off any injury, and get back out into the game. So if girls are more willing to report than boys, maybe boys are getting just as many concussions, or maybe they're getting more, but we don't capture those because they don't get reported and they don't get diagnosed. In 2017, a brain bank focused on women was announced with Pink Concussions and the National PTSD Brain Bank working together to actively recruit women over the age of 18 to donate their brains for research. In 2018, before the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, 3 female Olympians announced they would donate their brains to the Concussion Legacy Foundation so that their brains could help with concussion research. They were all Winter Olympic stars: US bobslayer Alana Myers, Canadian ice hockey player Hayley Wickenheiser, and US ice hockey player Angela Ruggiero. The summer of 2020 saw the largest ever women-specific rugby injury research project launched by a team of researchers and practitioners from across the world of sports science and medicine. The group had identified a significant gap in research into female rugby players and therefore set out to create an evidence base for women-specific interventions that will improve player safety for the future. Most injury prevention techniques in rugby are based on male-specific data, so any changes to rugby laws or coaching practices to reduce injuries are more likely to help male rather than female players. The ambition is that this research project will help redress the balance. Another area that is finally getting more coverage is the fact that women are known to have a higher risk of ACL, anterior cruciate ligament injury, than men. The chances of an ACL tear in female athletes are 2 to 8 times higher than in their male counterparts. Theories to explain this include anatomical differences, the width of the pelvis, the Q angle, how your quadriceps muscles in the thigh align with your kneecap, the size of the ACL, and the notch where it crosses the knee joint. Hormonal differences. The ACL has hormone receptors for estrogen and progesterone, so the menstrual cycle might impact the likelihood of a tear. Biomechanical differences. Knee stability depends on static ligaments, such as the ACL, along with dynamic stabilizers, including the muscles and tendons around the joint. All these things can be exacerbated as young female athletes go through puberty and the size and shape of their bodies change rapidly without neural pathways from brain to muscles having time to catch up. A lack of substantial strength and conditioning in the training regimes for young females has also been an issue historically, especially when you consider the huge impact on young bodies of jumping and landing in netball and basketball, or adapting to lateral contact in sports like rugby and football. In Women and Sport, Continuing a Journey of Liberation and Celebration, Dr. Pietro Tonino, Director of Sport Medicine at the Loyola University Medical Center, expresses concern for the rise in the number of female athletes he sees in his practice. Many of these injuries could be prevented with a simple warm-up program that could be done in minutes. One such program is the FIFA 11+, a warm-up that takes about 20 minutes to complete. In teams who did the warm-up twice a week, FIFA found a 30 to 50% reduction in the rate of ACL injuries among players. Having witnessed many female athletes struggling with the physical and mental challenges of rehabilitation after ACL injuries, one of my own daughters included, it's clear that this is an area that warrants increased research. Hopefully, more work will also be done to educate female players and their coaches and parents about the importance of prehabilitation and building strength around their joints as an integral part of any training program. It's not all negatives for women's bodies in sport compared to men's, though. While our body size, physical strength and power mean you're unlikely to see a woman breaking the world records of Usain Bolt or Michael Phelps anytime soon, when it comes to the toughest, longest, most brutal events, women seem to be pulling ahead. From swimming the English Channel 4 times to outrunning and outcycling men at ultra distances, our sisters are setting some extraordinary new records. In January 2019, 35-year-old Jasmine Paris made headlines across the world when she won the Spine Race, 268 miles non-stop along the Pennine Way. Her time of 83 hours, 12 minutes and 23 seconds beat her nearest male rival by almost 15 hours. Oh yes, and she completed the race while expressing milk for her baby daughter at the aid stations along the route. Later that year, Maggie Guttel became the first ever woman to win the Big Dog Backyard Ultra in Tennessee, a bonkers race that only ends with the last person standing. Maggie covered 250 miles running for 60 hours. Cyclists were breaking records that year too, when, in a watershed moment for female riders at ultra distance, 24-year-old German doctor Fiona Kolbinger won the transcontinental race, travelling 2,485 miles across Europe in just 10 days, 2 hours and 48 minutes. I am a keen open water swimmer who occasionally toys with the idea of one day swimming the English Channel. Only around 1,700 people have swum it unassisted, fewer than have climbed Everest. You'll therefore appreciate why, in September 2019, I watched in awe as US swimmer Sarah Thomas completed the Channel crossing 4 times in a row. It took her 54 hours and 10 minutes. The Channel is only 20 miles at its narrowest point, but she actually swam closer to 130 miles because of the strong tides. There are different views on why we are seeing this surge of women's success in ultra races. Some believe it might be because women have physically learnt to endure more pain during their lives. Most women deal with period pain each month, and about 10% experience severely debilitating conditions such as endometriosis. Add to that the pain of labour and childbirth, and you can see why some believe that if women develop internal coping mechanisms to deal with regular pain, the short-term pain of a race may fade in comparison. Others believe it is women's superior ability to deal with the mental challenges of ultra racing that gives them the advantage. Someone who knows all about this is 4 times Ironman triathlon world champion Chrissie Wellington. She told me, "Your success is about your ability to endure both physical and mental challenges, not to get too carried away with successes and to be able to overcome the lows. It's not just your physical prowess that's going to mean that you can succeed. It's about utilising all of the different strategies that you've got in your toolbox, mentally, to be able to override that discomfort or that self-doubt. It's as much coping with boredom or negative self-doubt as it is when you are in a state of physical discomfort. I think the most important weapon of all is the knowledge that you have overcome it in the past. In every single Ironman race I did, I wanted to quit, but I always look back at times in training or other races that I'd done when I've wanted to quit and I think, well, I didn't then, and I went on to achieve my goal. I went on to win, or went on to do a PB. So grateful that I overrode that voice. So, every time I want to quit, I remember the previous times I've wanted to. There's much more to be explored around the female body and sports performance, but it does feel as if the conversation is finally moving on. It's great to hear experts like Dr. Kirsty Elliott-Sale at Nottingham Trent University saying, athletes are very keen to talk about how they sleep, what they eat, how they train, what sports kit they're wearing, and yet, for such a long time, we've not really considered or spoken about menstrual cycles or hormonal contraceptive use. It's been pushed back, and I think the tide has turned. There is certainly more of an appetite now for this type of research to be implemented into elite sport. Thank you so much for listening to the serialisation of my book Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. If you'd like a copy, it's available in hardback and paperback in all good bookshops and online. The Game Changers podcast is free to listen to on all podcast platforms. Head over to fearlesswomen.co.uk to find out more about all of the incredible game changers I've spoken to in previous series. There are over 100 of them, including elite athletes, journalists, coaches, scientists, broadcasters and CEOs. As well as listening to all the episodes on the website, you can find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive network for all women working in sport. And you can register for the Fearless Women newsletter, a weekly review of the global developments in women's sport. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter at Sue Anstis. Finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd be so grateful if you could do two things. Firstly, if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd really appreciate it. And secondly, if there's anyone in your life, at home or at work, who you think might enjoy the podcast, please do let them know about it and help us spread the word about women's sport and the stories of these incredible game changers.